I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that reduces the risk and costs of cross-border transactions. As a board member, there are few better feelings than making a suggestion which adds quick material value to your organisation. I remember when one of our board members saved us $50,000 with a quick introduction to a group discount scheme for one of our key suppliers. I continue to feel grateful to this day. Alt21 can offer exactly this kind of quick win for board members. By using their foreign exchange and hedging services, you could reduce your company's costs by 90%. For a company that has just 10 million foreign exchange exposure through its revenues or cost base, that could be over 300,000 back into the business. Alt21 are so confident that they offer the best value in the market. They show you how much they make from fees in real time before and after any transaction. If you want to save your organisation money on its foreign exchange and hedging, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Neural. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Neural, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Tim Jackson, is general partner and CEO coach at Walking Ventures. He's been an active early-stage investor since 2000 and an advisor and non-executive director to a number of private companies. He served as a managing director of a $700 million European technology venture fund at the Carlyle Group, a US private equity firm. Formerly, he was founder and CEO of QXL, which went to IPO on the Nasdaq and the London Stock Exchange and was sold in 2007 for $1.9 billion. He wrote a weekly technology column for the Financial Times for 7 years, was a staff writer for The Economist and The Independent. Tim, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, Ollie, and it's lovely to be with you.
Tim, can we start by talking about your founder CEO journey? Can you take us to that moment when you realized QXL was going to IPO? What was going through your head?
Well, actually, I would say probably above all a feeling of relief, because even though it's common for founders of fast-growing tech startups to talk about how they're living their best life and they're loving everything about what they're doing, actually, it's remarkably stressful running a business that is growing exceedingly fast, but also is burning cash, as my company was. And therefore, at any given moment, there was always the delight and excitement of having just closed a successful funding round, combined with the terror of what would happen if we were unable to do the next one. And what seemed to me important about the impending IPO was actually the prospects that first, we would have a war chest that would be seriously larger than anything we'd had before. And second, that there was at least visibility towards profitability.
In episode 95 of Enter the Boardroom, Moonpig founder Nick Jenkins talked about the sliding door moment inputs from his board members that transformed the business's trajectory. You take us back to a board meeting at QXL that you'll never forget. Maybe it was a moment when everything clicked or a moment where you thought, this is a disaster.
Well, I think there were many positive moments, but perhaps it might be more interesting if I were to give you an example of a negative moment, which was that after we decided that the trajectory was going to be IPO, the investment banks were very keen to press debt on the company in the run-up to the IPO and encouraging us to grow as quickly as we could. One of the members of the board suggested the following simple piece of arithmetic. He said, look, it's clear that the market values our business on a per-user basis. And therefore, when we're thinking about customer acquisition, we should be willing to turn up the dial on the price we're willing to pay to acquire new customers to the point where it is almost the extra capital value that will be placed on the company by investors. That led to a discussion and a feeling that we should be willing to spend a huge amount of money on customer acquisition. I think in retrospect, that was profoundly mistaken.
A great example of that. Emperor's New Clothes, thinking of making sure that you're the last person to sort of pass on the time bomb, which I think you sometimes see in boardrooms during moments of mania and frenzy. You said many positive moments. That probably puts you into the minority of founder CEOs I speak with, most of whom the board is something that causes them huge moments of pain and friction. Can you perhaps give me examples for a founder CEO listening to this who's perhaps skeptical that the board can add any value to them to just demonstrate that it is possible?
The context here is that I was a young and inexperienced CEO, and this was my first go round the houses. And so there were all sorts of things I didn't know. I think a very common behavior among tech founders is that in order to summon up the energy to get out of bed every morning and go to work and try and make your company better, you have to be slightly more optimistic than is rational. And I think one of the things that really good board members can do is to temper your optimism by giving you the intermittent injection of kind of reality and helping you make sure that you don't drive decision-making from an inappropriate assessment of what's likely to happen. So, for example, one of my board members used to repeatedly say to me, when we were talking about the question of fundraising, raise money when you can, not when you need to. The context there is that it's very common for fast-growing companies when they're flying high and the weather outside is great because the world economy is doing great or the tech markets are doing great, to feel that they should be not wanting to leave any money on the table, not wanting to suffer any unnecessary dilution. But in fact, until you've got a clearly stable, clearly profitable business, you are betting the farm if you get close to running out of cash. And so it's exceptionally important to make sure that your number one priority is to ensure that you can fund the business to the point where you're confident it can become profitable. I was perhaps more conscious than the average CEO of my deficiencies in leading the business. And I thought it was very important to think like a shareholder rather than just to think like an employee. I decided that when the appropriate moment came for me to step aside, it would be the best idea if I initiated that rather than waiting for one of my investors to tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, don't you think it would be time to move on? And what I found was that when I introduced the subject to my board and said that I was planning to recruit my own successor and to move on as CEO, I found that they were, after being a bit surprised, ultimately very supportive and also super helpful in working through the process of managing the search for the successor. And I think if you haven't done much executive search, it's easy not to do it well. And I think it was quite striking to see that the board members that I had many times dealt with recruitment and many times seen how to do this process. You can't always get it right. I think perhaps maybe we didn't even get it right. But nevertheless, they were very helpful and offered lots of really useful input and oversight.
Okay, but you had already decided in your situation that you were going to leave. And so it sounds like where they were adding value to you was in thinking about how to go about hiring your successor, which I think is a really difficult thing to do as a CEO founder. Were there particular insights, frameworks they gave you that made that process better than it would otherwise have been?
I think a crucial issue is, what are the key criteria? What exactly are you looking for? And that's often a mix of inward-facing and outward-facing. Sometimes it's a mix of vertical experience versus general management expertise. And there's also a question of sweet spot in terms of the business size. You know, if you're running a business that's got 100,000 employees, then that's a very different job from a business with 10,000, 1,000, or 100 employees. What I found was that it was helpful to take the draft specifications for the job and share them with board members and get their input on them. I think it's more common than you might think for non-execs just to kind of cast a very quick eye over something and say, yeah, looks fine to me. But I think particularly when you're dealing with a less experienced CEO, you shouldn't think of yourself, if you're a board member, as just rubber stamping their initiative. Because it's often the case that CEOs necessarily have to acquire the habit of looking authoritative, even when they don't know as much as you might expect, given how authoritative they look. And I think that if you're an effective board member in that kind of situation, then you need to realize that even though what you've been told by the CEO might be said with a great deal of confidence, it might not always be right.
So it sounds like they really added value in getting that spec right and thinking about how that matched up to the journey the organization was going to go on after you left, rather than necessarily tapping into pipeline or persuading successful potential candidates to come and join. It was at that top end of the funnel where they were most valuable.
I think that's right. But I think also that getting candidates to come to join is generally a crucially important thing. And it also matters a lot in our case. This was relatively early in the history of the European commercial internet. And therefore, it wasn't obvious, as it is now, that joining a soon-to-be public technology company could be both a very exciting career move and something that is very value-adding personally.
Yeah, I was always very struck by, it's in one of Reid Hoffman's 8 Rituals of Great Boards, where he gets all of the board members to share how they might be able to help with any one of the issues that's on the CEO's plate at the time, one of which might be recruiting someone. And then if multiple board members know that individual, they will have all of those board members approach that candidate from different directions, so they have this overwhelming sense of feeling valued, which I always thought was a rather nice tactic when you were trying to hire someone who might not otherwise be interested in you.
I think it's a tremendous tactic. And in fact, it's analogous to something that some of the best VC firms do. One firm I know in particular, when they've decided that they want to invest in a company, one of the things they'll sometimes do is say, do you guys have a bit of time tomorrow? And when the company people say, yes, okay, we could meet tomorrow, then 5 or 6 partners will fly in from different European cities and show up on the doorstep of the company, not just to have an in-person discussion, because actually you can have great conversation through video calls, but to demonstrate the love by showing how many people were willing to go to the trouble of an uncomfortable airplane journey in order to come and say how sincerely they really want to do this deal.
You've since been on many other journeys as both an investor and a coach. What do you wish your board had done for you, knowing what you know now that they didn't at the time?
Well, I think one big thing, actually, it's that the underlying reason why I wanted to hand on my job to a successor is because I felt that I was becoming less effective as the company grew. And I felt it was in danger of reaching a point where I was destroying rather than adding value to the business because of my own lack of experience and lack of capacity. A discussion that never came up at the board meeting was coaching. And one of the things I think which has become, thankfully, much more open in recent years is that it has become okay for CEOs to admit that they fear they might be getting out of their depth, and okay for board members to support them when they're doing that. My own experience putting on my coaching hat is that it's surprisingly common for VCs to work on the assumption that 75% of all the founders whom they back will not in fact be running the business at the time of exit. I think that of those 75%, 25% probably cannot be changed, and they definitely would not be the appropriate person for the journey all the way through. But of that middle 50%, I would guess half could, with the appropriate support, continue to be the best choice for CEO of the business. The cost of replacing the CEO of a company in time and hassle and lost value is very high. And therefore, if you can do something that will help the CEO continue to be effective for an extra year or an extra 2 years or an extra 3 years, that is of huge value. And I think that I and my board never had a coaching discussion. I always viewed it as binary. Either I can do it, in which case I should stay, or I can see a time when I won't be able to do it, in which case I should make preparations now to leave.
Picture this. A founder CEO calls you in the middle of the night, completely overwhelmed. They just had a brutal board meeting and they feel like they're losing control. What's the most common reason, in your experience, CEOs reach this breaking point, and what should boards be doing differently?
Well, I think there's actually 2 types of breaking point. One of them is where the CEO realizes they're at breaking point. And the other, perhaps the even slightly more common source of the late night call, is when actually the board has reached breaking point and has realized that they have lost confidence in the CEO. Now, paradoxically, I've never had such a call in my capacity as coach. And part of the reason for that is because I'm keen when talking to CEOs to make sure I understand the full context, the bad as well as the good of what's going on in the relationships. And a late night call like that would indicate a surprise, which would indicate our not having talked about it well in advance about what was going on. Now, I did get such a call, in fact, about 4 weeks ago. It was from a CEO that I don't coach, but that I had met recently, who'd been talking to me about what he was doing with his fundraising. And I'd expressed some concerns about the direction of travel and what was going on. And I had kind of cautioned him that I would be worried on his behalf about the attitude of his board to the way things were going. And, sure enough, quite a short period of time later, they decided that things were not going as they should, and they decided that it was his problem and they needed to get rid of him.
If memory serves, you do have a place in your coaching setup for emergency calls for CEOs. So there must be some things that are coming up last minute that are unplanned for some of them. What's typically at the root of that board members listening might be able to help address?
Well, a classic example is an M&A deal falling out of bed. When you've seen lots of companies and you've seen lots of transactions, you realize that a proportion of them don't happen, don't finish, don't close. If you're doing it for the first or second time as a CEO, then it's easy to become a little bit overconfident. And therefore, you could be quite hard hit when something happens close to the last minute, when the buyer either wants to pull out or tries to retrade. So that's one example. Another example is, and this is actually very relevant to the discussion of terms between companies and their investors, that in the tech world, venture capitalists will very often have a long list of consent rights, things the company can't do without the consent of the investor director. There'll be a separate set of rights, which are things they can't do without the consent of this class of shareholder. CEOs often place a great deal of weight on their personal relationship with the partner in the venture firm who is occupying the board seat. And therefore, it can be a bit of a crisis when they get a call from the GP, the general partner in the fund, saying, it's been lovely being on your board, but I just wanted to let you know that tomorrow I'm leaving the firm and going to a different firm, and my place on the board will be taken by X. And that can prove to be a bit of a crisis, because then the CEO will discover that now there's somebody who's exceedingly powerful, who's got the ability to veto lots of important things, with whom they have no prior relationship. If I was to give a third example, it would be that many fast-growing companies will pay a lot of attention to strategic hires, to hiring people who are overpowered for the current size of company, but who they think will be perfect for the much bigger organization that they expect the company to grow into. Those hires are hugely valuable and also quite risky. And once in a while, they don't work out. And therefore, if there's sometimes a trigger for a late night call, it will be, oh crikey, this superstar whom I brought in 5 months ago either is not working out and I'm concerned about what should I do, or has told me that they're moving on and it's not working for them.
So for a board member listening to this and hearing those 3 examples of someone making a mistake on overhiring, finding their key relationship at the investor director moving on unexpectedly, or having an M&A deal fall out of bed, what can board members do to help CEOs better anticipate those scenarios?
Well, so obviously they're all different cases. If we take them in reverse, with M&A, I think it's crucially important for the company to have a plan B and not to be putting all its eggs in the basket of a successful transaction. And that means that the board members need to be intermittently reminding the CEO that we all hope this is going to go ahead. We're all very supportive, but we're aware that it might not. And let's make sure that we've got a clear trajectory for what we're going to do if it doesn't. We don't want to be left in a pickle if it doesn't work. In terms of a strategic hire that goes wrong, I think on that matter, the valuable board input comes much earlier on. If you've already got somebody who's been in the job 4.5 months and they're sort of teetering on the brink, then that's a sign that you could have addressed the issue much sooner. And that's partly to do with selection. It's partly to do with onboarding. And it's also partly to do with setting the right expectations. And it's paradoxically the case that CEOs will often kind of mentally check out because of the probationary period in someone's contract. That if their contract says, we'll review how things are going after 6 months, then it's much more common than you might expect for the CEOs to say, oh, well, I've got a few misgivings, but don't worry, I've got a diary note in 6 months' time to come back and check and seeing what I think of this. That is not at all, in my experience, the most successful way to operate. What I've seen happen is that sometimes board members, but often it needs an outside nudge, and this is something I will sometimes discuss with the CEO in a coaching capacity, to think about not what would the person look like when they are working at full capacity, but how long would you expect it to take for them to be at 20% capacity or 40% capacity? And how far forward are they actually at that point? Because it's quite commonly the case that when you look back, you can see that failed hires had indications much earlier on that things were not working out.
Are there patterns in the behaviours or personalities of the CEOs who you see getting most value out of boards?
I think absolutely yes. I would say that 2 things that immediately spring to mind are openness and conscientiousness. It's much more common than you might think for CEOs to be in a sort of always be closing mode when speaking to their board members, particularly when their board members are investors who have large stakes in the business. It's an understandable position to take to say every conversation with an investor is an investor relations conversation. But it's sadly more common than you would expect that CEOs show up to the board meeting with the private objective of demonstrating to the board members that, yes, you made the right decision by investing in this business. And my sense is that is not at all a helpful starting point for a board meeting, because what you're hoping to do is to identify things that you could do better and to have a discussion about how you could do them better. If therefore your premise is that everything is going gangbusters and nothing could possibly be any better, it's pretty hard to have that discussion. So I think the openness of the CEO is a crucial thing. Perhaps a secondary thing is, and we're talking about the CEO side, right? Not the non-executive directors. I think a second thing actually is just a demonstration of conscientiousness. My sense is that when outside board members have a high degree of confidence that the CEO really is giving it their all and is doing a good job, then that creates space for very open and positive discussions about things that aren't working. And if by contrast, the CEO is kind of conveying the feeling that they're dialing it in, that they're not really giving of their very best to the business, then that will slightly taint the atmosphere.
You've echoed some of the comments that Dr. Thomas Chamorro-Premasic made in episode 113 by talking there about the importance of openness and conscientiousness, which are things that he says you can measure very easily. Curious to hear whether that is something you think boards should be measuring, if those are two characteristics that make CEOs better at engaging and getting value out of their board. Is that something at the assessment and selection process that you should be assessing?
I think they're definitely measurable. And in fact, as you know, they are two of the big five in the psychometric personality test. My sense is that even though in business and in strategy consulting and in investment banking, the Myers-Briggs assessment framework is more popular, I think it has less test-to-test consistency, where you might wake up on a Tuesday and get one 4-letter combination from Myers-Briggs, and then you might wake up the following Friday and get a different assessment. I think it's true that boards can learn a lot by understanding the personalities and the preferences of candidates for CEO roles. You can either do it quantitatively with those kinds of tools. I think you can also do it qualitatively. When I'm wearing an investor hat and I'm making a venture capital investment on behalf of Walking Ventures, one of the things that I will often do is have a long meeting with a founder or CEO about their life before this job, not about the business, where the agenda is not for them to be showing slides or persuading me why it's a great investment, but actually just talking about their history of work before that and how it's influenced them.
As a coach, do you ever anticipate that a board should replace a CEO before it then ends up happening?
Yes. One of the key things that I discuss with CEOs is the fact that there is no shame in concluding that a company has grown beyond your sweet spot in terms of the skills you have to operate it effectively. I think that the CEO role is dramatically different each time you increase the number of people in the team by a factor of 5. A point can come where the CEO is not hugely happy, not spending their time the way they want, and not being as effective as the best candidate might be in the job. However, when I have coaching relationships, I think it's crucially important to open up those discussions with the CEO in a safe space. Because the problem is that CEOs quite justifiably feel that if they start musing or brainstorming in front of their board members about their own longevity as CEO, that can unwittingly start a process that they might not want to start. When talking to CEOs, make sure that we're keeping an eye on how long do they expect to continue to be the ideal person in this job. If it gets to the point where it's time for them to hand on, what I usually hope to happen in our coaching discussions is that they have realized it before their board has. I would think of it as a coaching fail if a CEO that I'm working deeply with gets a tap on the shoulder and is caught by surprise.
Can you talk me through in more detail that scale up? Because if I think back to when I first started and you were helping me, it was game changing. I didn't have a clue what I was doing, but even more so back then. And I certainly recognized the change, from when you first have 5 people in the organization to 10, there's a shift. And then from 10 to 20, there's a shift. And then probably from 20 to 40, there's another shift. And we're now approaching 60. I feel like we're now getting to a scale where it feels reasonably modular, and I'm plugging in people into the 2 or 3 layers below me. And as long as I continue to empower and coach those below me as a CEO, that I think that scales as a model. I'm not anticipating a big change. What am I missing?
Well, I think you've actually put your finger on some of the key changes, that in the very early stages where there's serious questions about, can the company build a product that people want to buy, and can the company secure enough sales to actually clearly be a real business and the platform on which something can be built. When that happens, founders and CEOs are often going to be deeply involved in the product building process and in the sales process. And they will also often be directly supervising individual contributors who are doing things. It won't be very long before the company is organized in teams. You have leaders for each team, and your job then is to work closely with the leaders. There's a little asterisk here for the recent discussion triggered by Paul Graham about founder mode and how much is it the case that founders should sort of step back incrementally. But let's put that aside for a moment. What naturally happens if you do it effectively is that you build around yourself a group of people, each of whom is able to manage a part of the team. The result is that you're no longer a required cog in the machinery. A specified number of weekly meetings do not fall to pieces if you are absent or unable to attend. They can continue to run in your absence. You can take a couple of weeks off and the business will continue to run and continue to grow. And perhaps a really important thing is that once you've got a growth engine that's working and a team that's stable, it's then quite important to sort of lift your nose from the here and now and the individual problems of individual clients and individual product features and look around a bit more broadly at the horizon. I was taking a walk with a couple of founders this morning in the park, and we were talking about the fact that their business is doing amazingly well and has achieved an extraordinary growth rate and a very impressive product, a very impressive number of customers. They have not yet really had a chance to separate themselves from the business enough to be able to start thinking about where do we think our industry is going? What do we think is going to happen over the next 10 years? What should our view be about exit? What should our view be about fundraising? Because it's a bootstrap business rather than one that has got venture capitalists already on the board. So I think you're quite right. Big changes, and that the successful CEOs are those that adapt what they do and how they spend their time to the needs of the growing business.
Does that cap out at some point in your experience? When I think now today about my role as CEO, I think of it as getting the strategy right, the clarity and alignment around strategy. I think about it as getting the people right and creating the environment where we can acquire good talent and it can thrive, and then making sure that the funding is in place to allocate resources to wherever the capital is best allocated. And so I sort of see that role as, okay, the numbers and the size will get bigger as we continue to scale. But should I be anticipating fundamental change beyond that? Should board members, listening to this, who've got an organization going through that journey and a CEO going through that journey, be anticipating that their CEO is going to need to evolve?
I think you've put your finger on it with those three key activities of the CEO. And I think I agree entirely that those are the responsibilities that matter. There's one thing I would add that I think is crucially important. When companies go wrong as they grow, the commonest way in which they go wrong is that the CEO recruits in new senior people, and the senior people look like they're doing a great job, but the CEO does not really have adequate visibility to understand how does the responsibility of that head of department, how does the effectiveness of that head of department look from underneath rather than from on top? Because it's often the case, sadly, that people who are not very effective are very good at managing upwards, at giving their boss the impression that they're doing a terrific job. It's only the people who report to them who know what a crappy job they're doing. And therefore, I think this raises quite an important issue when you're a CEO, which is about what do you discuss one-on-one with the people who report to you that will help you assess whether the values and the processes and the approaches that you think are important in the company and that you are trying to disseminate across the company, the culture that you're trying to maintain as the company grows, it's important for you to be able to assess how well is the person reporting to you doing that with a pyramid of people underneath them. And often that is really a source of a major problem. And you discover that someone 2 levels below you is being treated in a way that you might consider entirely inappropriate, or is being wrongly managed, or is not being supported, or is not being coached. Those things are, I think, something which a CEO will often want to pay some attention to.
That's interesting. I feel like I'm not very good at that bit of picking up on those things through those discussions, and I rely much more on people analytics to spot data across the team, and I rely on Ask Me Anything lunches with sort of random cross sections of the team, and I rely on things like the sort of anonymous Slidos at town halls. Are there other ways that you've seen CEOs effectively kind of get on top of that issue besides just those asking the report?
Well, I think you've got a great list there for starters. People analytics is hugely valuable because it's usually the case that an unexpectedly poor manager will get lower ratings from the people in their team than the rest, and that should become visible quite quickly. And you also used the word anonymous when you were talking about the Ask Me Anything sessions, because there's not much use having an AMA if someone asking a question feels that they will be exposed to their boss if they have to ask it publicly. So anonymity is quite important for that. If I were to add one other thing, it's that sometimes it's valuable for the CEO to meet individual people across the company, perhaps in groups, on a regular basis, where, if possible, it can be face-to-face, and it's an opportunity for them in a very small group setting to talk about how they feel about their life, their job, the company, their career, and so on. I've seen many CEOs block out a regular breakfast slot in which they'll have breakfast with half a dozen people from different places in the company, and they can learn a great deal from that.
Can we move on to talk about your investor director perspective to complete the trilogy? Investor directors often think they add value, but do they really? And where have you seen the biggest gap between perception and reality?
Well, I think you're absolutely spot on in identifying the problem. And it's partly because there is, as far as I know, no such thing as a venture capital firm that will proudly announce to companies that they bring nothing more than money. Everybody wants to believe they add value. It reminds me a little bit of the joke that they used to make in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, where factory managers would say, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. I think that venture capitalists often will pretend to add value and the companies will pretend to believe them. Part of it also is that as the venture capital industry has matured, it used to be a cottage industry, largely people by former operators, by people who had been founders and CEOs of their own companies and who knew how difficult it was. What's changed is that a much higher proportion of the people in venture are now people with excellent academic credentials and often lots of big company experience, consulting, law, banking, and so on, but perhaps a bit less operating experience. And those people, particularly given the pyramid structure of the firms in which they work, are quite keen to demonstrate to their bosses how value-adding they are. And that sometimes creates a tendency to, as it were, trying to fix things that aren't broken, or trying to get more understanding of things and unwittingly putting an excessive information burden on the management of the business.
I'm guessing you've coached CEOs who've had difficult investor directors on their board. Can you talk me through how you do that in such a way that a board member listening to this might learn from?
Well, yes. I'm slightly reminded of the beginning of Anna Karenina, where Tolstoy talks about all happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. I think that there are many different ways in which an investor director can be ineffective. One, as I said, is the excessive information demand. Particularly because in early stage tech businesses, you are navigating in the fog. You often have to make decisions on the basis of very limited information. And it's very tempting if you're a board director just to rattle off a request for a set of pieces of analysis from the management, which you may not realize are going to take multiple days of some poor sod's time to put together. And unless you have clarity on that, and we'll talk about this in a moment, unless you have clarity on how it's going to be used and how it's going to be useful, you need to be quite wary of that. So I'll often encourage CEOs to have an open discussion about investor directors on the subject of information requests, where there'll be a set of criteria that are agreed for what counts as the right trigger for asking the team to go and do some work and go and produce a piece of analysis. I think that ineffective outside directors are often ineffective in different ways between public and private companies. But I think in public companies, there's a little more of a tendency to adopt a kind of ceremonial role and to nod wisely and sagely as the lavishly prepared presentations are delivered to you and broadly saying, jolly good, carry on, this all looks fine. In public companies, there's a risk of not challenging enough. In private companies, I think the risk is sometimes challenging too much. And it's quite easy to unwittingly demoralize CEOs and founders by suggesting somehow that you as investor director think that you know better than they do how to run the business. Anyone who as a teenager learned to drive and went driving with their parents would have the knowledge that some parents can be very wise and thoughtful in letting you make your own mistakes. Others are a little bit nervous and can't resist reaching over and grabbing the wheel and shouting, "Let me drive." And I think that rookie investor directors will sometimes suffer from the let me drive problem. They'll start getting involved in too high a level of detail.
I love that image. I won't ask you which of the parent types you were. It sounded like you have an algorithm for determining the threshold for when a company or the CEO should go in and find the information. What does that look like? I mean, I often spin it on its head and say, that's a great idea. Could you go and do that for us? Because we're, short resourced, and actually it sounds like you really know what we need there. But what's your algorithm for fending off or helping determine which of those requests to pursue?
Well, I think actually step one of the algorithm is exactly what you've said, which is that somebody who's asking for information in order to perform some piece of analysis or in order to come to a conclusion will often think about the analytical burden very differently if the burden has to be carried by them rather than if it's carried by someone else. So it's always a great first step to say, yes, God bless you, go off and do the research and then come back with the answers and let's all have a discussion about it. But I think also it's quite valuable to focus on how much the information is actionable. And therefore, it's always good to have a discussion along the lines of, what might we learn from this? And how would we operate the business differently depending on the answers that we get? And it reminds me a little bit of the way that some strategy consultants, when they go into an engagement with a company, will actually write a draft of the concluding recommendations, the slide deck that's going to be their deliverable at the end of the engagement. Not so much because they already know the answers in advance, but because it really helps to clarify one's mind to think about the end result and think about what would you need to get there.
You're echoing an insight that Jennifer Sundberg shared in episode 57, where she talked about lots of boards who get themselves tied in knots around data. And her fallback was always to say, what's the problem that you're trying to solve? Let's get really clear about solving the problem before you start asking for the data. Once you've understood the problem, you can take a much more of a scientific method approach to it.
I think that makes very good sense. And in a way that I think is a very usefully applicable measure to one-off pieces of analysis. Stepping back, I think there's also something which boards and non-executive directors can very usefully do, and it's about the construction of the board pack. I know you've discussed with lots of CEOs the common complaint that the administrative burden of putting together the information that the board requires is disproportionate compared to the value. That's a common complaint. I think a good way to solve the problem is for board members to ask about what internal metrics the management themselves are looking at. Because often the board and the management ought to be interested in having the same dashboard of how the business is going. If you can reduce duplication by getting into a situation where essentially what you deliver to the board if you're the CEO is surprisingly close to the stuff that you look at as a management team, that can hugely reduce the overhead.
That's interesting. Jerry Brown, the chair of Tesco and Burberry, who says he never has a board pack that is not based on management information only. He will never have something that is produced only for the board. Can you ever see a situation where there might be material where it would be justified to have it made specifically for the board in terms of reporting, in terms of dashboards and metrics rather than necessarily specific issues?
Broadly speaking, I agree with that. And actually, I have noticed, I've sat on the boards of about 20 different companies. And one of the things I've noticed that is a very clearly negative signal is when the CEO changes frequently the reporting format to the board. Because often that will indicate a sort of lack of confidence about where is the business going. Sometimes it will also indicate the fact that the numbers aren't looking very good, because obviously you can learn a great deal by looking at numbers not as points but as lines, looking at series and looking at trends. If you keep changing what you report so that the format is always different, that means you can never compare this month's with last month's. And therefore changing formats are at least an amber and sometimes a red flag.
Good insight for board members listening to this, thinking about how to diligence the company, looking at the consistency of board packs from prior months. Jerry Brown also talked about the importance of understanding macro trends that organizations are sailing into for board members, and then allowing the organization to work backwards from that and work out what they might do. I'm very struck at the moment looking at a lot of these AI startups where it strikes me they haven't really thought through. They've figured out something clever to do, but they haven't really thought through much more than 5-10 years or 5-10 years out. You're always very thoughtful, interested to hear what are the key macro trends you're preparing for at the moment as an investor director.
Well, I think just to go first to your general point, it's entirely to be expected and entirely appropriate that the CEO and the management team of the business should have 80% of their focus on running the business as it is now. And if you are a non-executive director or an investor director, then by definition, you must have a broader perspective. And it is absolutely your job to be asking questions about direction of travel and how the world will change. I think that we are entering a period of great uncertainty. We have already entered a period of great uncertainty in terms of geopolitics and international trade and economics. And it's really pretty hard to predict what might happen even in the next 4 years, let alone the next 5 or 10. The most important technical trend facing us is, of course, AI. And the thing that's clear is that AI seems to me that it's going to be as important as the automobile, or perhaps a great deal more important than that, in terms of how it changes society and work and industry. What it has in common with the automobile is that there are a very large number of companies already set up to take advantage of the opportunity, and most of those companies will fail and lose money. For me, it is a constant question and a constant object of study. What can we know about what is the recipe for building a successful business, either in the AI space or for implementing AI in an existing business? Board members and for companies in the New Role Network, is that the general thing that you expect when innovation comes along is that the bulk of the effect of the innovation is felt in terms of consumer surplus, that the companies or the individuals that are buying the new product actually get more of the benefit, self-evidently, than the people who are selling it. So this means that all kinds of companies will be able to work more effectively and better with the same budgets and people, or will be able to maintain their current levels with a lot less money and a lot fewer people. That has fairly terrifying implications for society, to which I don't know the answer.
Time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a quick question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Happy to go.
Best book every board member should read, and why?
Well, actually, it's a work of fiction. It's The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope, a 19th century novel. And I think it's just a gripping portrait of what happens when a business fails and when there's a lack of communication that causes a founder to go AWOL.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
I think it's perhaps overestimating one's knowledge as an outside advisor. My rule of thumb is that internal managers will have 3 orders of magnitude more knowledge about a business than I will as an outside advisor, and it's important to behave accordingly.
What's one board ritual that sounds ridiculous that actually works?
I think making sure that the quietest people speak. It's very tempting and surprisingly easy to let the most articulate and the most aggressive dominate the discussion. But we all know that's not the best way to go.
Favourite quote?
I'm not a fan of Peter Thiel's, but I think his line that we overestimate what we can achieve in a year and underestimate what we can achieve in a decade is very true.
Most significant professional insight?
I think it's something that we were talking about before. It's the fact that the job of a CEO is very different depending on the scale of the business, and that one's business card can stay the same while the job changes beyond all recognition. And both incumbents and boards need to be aware of that.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I've changed my mind in a sort of secular, structural sense about how much value I think that outside directors can add. I think it's important for directors to be a little bit more humble and a little bit more aware of their limitations. And I now have lower ambitions than I used to in terms of my own ability to be transformative to a business.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
I executed a piece of spectacularly unsuccessful radical candor where I gave an underperforming CEO some very frank feedback in front of other board members. It was at a point of near desperation where I was very concerned about the direction and the future of the company, but it was wholly counterproductive, because I think if you don't retain the trust and confidence of everybody in the room, then whatever you say cannot be effective.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I think I started out very much aware of the pressures on CEOs, which comes from having an operating background. I think that now I'm also aware of the limitations on the room for maneuver of the company as it grows. It becomes harder to turn the ship as the ship gets bigger.
If you had a billboard in front of every boardroom, what 3 things would it say?
I think it would probably say 1, do no harm. 2, ask for only actionable information. 3, this is really a chair role rather than a non-executive role, but it's always valuable to ask yourself what has not been discussed in this meeting, what has not been considered. It's often there in those interstitial bits that the greatest value can be found.
Tim, I find it very difficult to ask you any questions normally because you're always asking me questions. So this has been an absolute treat to be able to ask you all the questions. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Well, Ollie, I've loved it. Thank you very much.